Hey everyone, and welcome back to the Divine Council mini series. Wow, we have traversed quite a bit of territory over the last 12 weeks, coming up on lesson 13 today. So, where did we start? We started with divine plurality. Of course, we got really comfortable with this concept of there being multiple gods, albeit lesser created gods or Elohim, but nonetheless multiple gods. Yahweh, of course, being the most high over all the nations. Next, we introduced evil. Where did it come from? What is it? Then we went into the three rebellions that changed the course of human history in a very real way. We looked at the punishment and the judgment handed down by Yahweh following that tumultuous Babel event where he scattered the nations, fixed the borders, and put these territorial entities over the nations, keeping Jacob for himself. So, in the last few weeks, we started to come up on the Abrahamic covenant and we hung out in those waters for a little bit and we sort of picked it apart. And what we realized was there is a lot more to it than meets the eye. There's a lot more to it than the Sunday school version. We looked at the promise of us as believers, children of Abraham, becoming like the celestial beings, becoming like the gods, becoming part of the reconstituted divine council. So that was a lot of stuff. Where does that leave us? Well, there's something that we haven't really discussed so much, although it goes hand in hand with these territorial entities and these gods, and this is the idea of idolatry. It doesn't take much reading into the biblical narrative before we start to see idolatry rear its ugly head. Of course, we're first introduced in Exodus 20 as the first commandment, you shall have no other gods before me, and everything stemmed out of that, unfortunately. Now, as we move through the biblical narrative in the Old Testament, we see the Israelites moving away, or apostate Israel. Now, when we think of this word apostate coming from the Greek word apostasia, we tend to think of people who have just walked away from the faith. Sometimes Christians are accused of this. Oh, you're apostate, you walked away. But in the context of the biblical narrative, apostate or apostasia had more to do with a certain type of seduction. So it had to do with the monotheistic worship, a person worshiping Yahweh, but then being seduced in a very real way by these other gods or these other entities. So it's not simply just a walking away of the faith. It's deeper than that. There's a connotation of seduction involved. We see this in Second Thessalonians when it comes down to the restrainer and the lawless one. We talk about many people going, apostasia is the word used in Second Thessalonians. People are going to walk away, not by their own accord, but because they have been seduced by something. And of course, we know this will end with the rise of the Antichrist and the lawless one, but there is a very real seduction going on in there. So this is what we're going to get into today. So if you guys are ready for it, let's go ahead and get on it. All right, all about idolatry. Okay. What is idolatry? What is it not? Where did it come from? And why is it such a problem? These are the things we're going to get into today. Now, in the modern world, there is lots of conjecture about what constitutes idolatry with very little or any consideration for what the primary text material says, and also not considering the landscape at that time. There was very real things going on here. There were cultural things going on here that we just can't grasp today. And of course, in the back of our minds, as we move through this landscape and we consider what idolatry means and the gods behind idolatry, we always have to keep in the background the Deuteronomy 32 worldview, right? This is the big bang sort of in Genesis here. This is that the new thing after Babel. We now have this Deuteronomy 32 worldview where Yahweh has scattered the nations and fixed the borders, and we have territorial entities over these nations. Although, as we have mentioned many times in the past, all authority still under Yahweh. So although these nations were being governed by lesser created deities or Elohim, all authority was still meant to be under Yahweh. So, in light of this landscape, we have to consider the prohibition against idolatry, right? Okay, so we have all of these nations underneath the territorial guardians. And then in Exodus, for the first time, we see the first commandment here: you shall have no other gods before me, to his people, right? Do not be seduced by these other territorial guardians. We have to consider, as I mentioned, the level of persuasion these territorial entities had, not only on their own people, but on God's people as well. So, we're going to look at a few different examples of how this plays out. And then we're also going to look at concerns in the New Testament, specifically expressed by Paul as a warning not to fall into the trap of idolatry. Okay, so getting down to the roots of it. By definition, idolatry is the worship of someone or something other than God as though it were God. It represents a sort of tension between genuine faith and the spiritual conception of God, and an attempt to degrade and even materialize spiritual practice. So, in the course of the Old Testament, what we do not see is a movement from idolatry toward pure worship of Yahweh. Rather, we see people worshiping their creator and then becoming caught in a seduction towards polytheistic practices, meaning the worship of multiple gods. For example, let's look at the golden calf incident, for example, in Exodus 32. A lot of people laugh when they see this. You know, Moses was taking too long up on the mountain. They decided they were going to worship a calf. What's that about? Well, now that we know about the Deuteronomy 32 worldview, and we know about the cosmic landscape at this time with these territorial guardians being rivals of Yahweh, you can imagine there was actually a lot more going down there than what we're seeing at first hand. So in Exodus 32:1, the people gather around Aaron, Moses' brother, and say, "Come, make us gods who will go before us." So here's where we start to see this apostasia creep in. You can imagine they're left by themselves without their leader. Their leader is up on Sinai getting the commandments from Yahweh. He's a little distracted at the moment. And so perhaps we have these certain territorial entities, these demonic figures coming in, offering a sort of seduction, offering something that maybe Yahweh can't offer, because Moses is taking too long up on the mountain, but maybe there's something that we can offer you. There's something we can go before you. And so this golden calf becomes the representation of whatever God that was. So, and I know in the church version, the Sunday school version, we often laugh at the golden calf because it seems absolutely ridiculous. But I promise you, there was a lot more going down in that landscape than what meets the eye. So, stereotypically, idolatry is viewed as a handcrafted idol, something that you make with your hands. This is what we tend to think of in the biblical context. But it's important to remember that idolatry extended beyond this. Idolatry took many different forms, all with the same intent of turning a person's heart and mind towards a counterfeit sense of security. And I can imagine in the golden calf narrative here, there was a counterfeit sense of security that was being offered to these people here. All right, so let's take a look at how idols functioned. And I know we've talked about this in the past. Ancient Mesopotamia in Egypt, a person would craft an idol, then an open mouth ceremony would commence, which its purpose was, of course, to invite the deity to inhabit the idol, to animate it, so that the people could communicate with the deity at a centralized location. So if the idol was damaged or was destroyed in some way, they would simply just repeat the process. It doesn't eliminate the deity. If it was damaged, it's a shame, but they would make another one with the intention that the deity would come down and now animate the new idol. So it doesn't, so the idol would be treated as if it were a god, although it's important to note that there is a distinction here, because when we see words like false gods and idols and we lump them together in the context of modern Christianity, it's very, very difficult to pick those apart once you've lumped them together. This is why many people have a very difficult time understanding the divine council worldview, because they get the notion in their mind that people are crafting these idols and then these gods are simply figments of their imagination. And I tell you, there's a lot more going on than that. So once you understand this divine council worldview, it all makes sense, and we can start to differentiate between what the idol is and what the territorial entity behind it is, or whatever the demonic entity is that is meant to be inhabiting this idol. So they function as deceit, right? Idols function as deceit. 2 Kings 17:15 tells us false gods make false people. And right, false gods, this isn't to be confused with the gods not existing, right? We have to differentiate that. Idolaters, people who engage in idolatry, are often grouped with liars. And Revelation 21:8 says, "But as for the cowardly, the faithless, the detestable, as for murderers, the sexually immoral, sorcerers, idolaters, and all liars, their portion will be in the lake that burns with fire and sulfur, which is the second death." So, although we know the idols themselves were nothing, right? They were just the objects that were crafted with human hands. We get a sense in the biblical narrative of how these idols were spoken of as if they were the gods themselves. Because remember, at this time, these people believed that the deity was inhabiting this idol. Therefore, the language was used somewhat synonymously. So we see a hints of personification being possibly alluding to the deity that inhabited them. For example, in Hosea 4:12, where it says, "An evil spirit of idolatry has led the people astray and oppresses them," in Hosea 4:19. And then if we go to the pseudepigrapha in the Testament of Solomon 26:9, he states, "I became a laughing stock to the idols and demons." So this language is being used synonymously here, because if you had the idol, then it was understood that the deity was probably inhabiting that idol. At least this is what they believed. So we'll continue on with this a little bit. Idols function as symbols of power. The idol and God, as I mentioned, became almost synonymous with one another, and people use these idols to demand things from their gods: oracles, prosperity, being on the winning side of a battle. These sorts of portable gods they would take with them served as a type of divine accompaniment, much in the way, I guess it would be a counterfeit version of us who know that Yahweh is with us all the time. We as believers are indwelled by the Holy Spirit, and He is with us always. These, in the pagan culture, they felt the same way, except they had to physically take the idol with them in order to feel that they had some sort of divine accompaniment wherever they were going, whether that be in war or whatever it is. For example, the Israelites, they mirrored a lot of what the pagan culture did in terms of how they treated the Ark of the Covenant. As I mentioned, people would take their idols into war with them, but then we have the Israelites with a similar thought process, and that they would take the Ark of the Covenant into war with them in hopes that Yahweh would deliver their enemies into their hands. For example, in 1 Samuel 4:5, the Philistines state, "A god has come into the camp, woe to us." So the one with the idol was presumed to have power. So idols were also spoils of war. For example, when the Philistines took the Ark of the Covenant in 2 Samuel 5:21, it's actually considered a trophy of war. And even without an image of Yahweh, it still represents his presence and blessing. So, unlike their neighbors, however, the Israelites' symbol for God was the absence of an image above the cherubim on the Ark of the Covenant. So you can see there are similarities in the culture with how they treated certain objects. But there's a big difference between the Ark of the Covenant and Yahweh, and the significance of the absence of the image of Yahweh, and what the pagan nations, what the disinherited nations were doing with these idols that they carried with them. So the idols, although not hearing or seeing, also acted as witnesses. They functioned in this way. So just as one might say, "God is my witness," as Paul did, the pagan culture had idols that acted as witnesses to oaths, treaties, covenants, etc. We see in Isaiah 44:8 and 9, "The prophets berate the idolaters, since their witnesses neither see nor hear." So this, of course, is a prophetic call against using idols as witnesses. But As I mentioned, when you understand the divine council worldview, when you understand the Deuteronomy 32 worldview, all of a sudden we can't mistake the intelligence of these people. We can't just say they were acting like children, bowing down to a golden calf and making little dolls. This is what they believed about their gods, that their gods were with them, and this is how they carried their gods with them. This is such a distinction with us as imagers of Yahweh. The fact that we exist makes us an image. Jesus Christ is the image of the Father, and we are reflected in that image. So that is the significance of us essentially being Yahweh's idols. It's quite a wonderful thing. Moving forward, idols as political prostitution. I mean, Solomon comes to mind, allowing idols in the temple following his numerous marriages, and which led to foreign political religious entanglements, right? So it was a whole mess. Of course, idolatry opposes God's mandate, first and foremost. For example, there were many cults that were formed around idolatry. So it wasn't just a matter of carrying these idols with you and that's all there is to it. There were entire cults formed around this idolatry. It was a thing of pride, and it prided sexual impurity contrary to God's law was a huge thing. For example, Baal and Asherah were considered fertility gods associated with these cults. So there's so many different things stemming out of idolatry in many different forms that I think we struggle to grasp. As moderns, we really struggle to grasp here, but we can certainly try. So I would be remiss if I didn't stop and talk about the teraphim, because we hear about the teraphim a couple times and it's not very well explained, but it certainly falls into this category. So we'll go ahead and try to explain it the best we can. So the teraphim is appropriately dubbed a household god or gods because it's them. Teraphim is plural. It's usually found within a family's house. And the first instance we see of this is in Genesis 31:19, when Rachel, Jacob's wife, steals the teraphim from her father Laban's house. So this is coming from the plural word teraphim. It's an image or cult object used as a domestic deity or oracle, particularly by ancient Semitic people. So in Genesis 31, we get the idea that the teraphim is generally small in structure, as you see there on the screen, because Rachel was able to discreetly conceal the teraphim when she stole it. But then we also see that they can be pretty close to the size of an adult person, because if you look at 1 Samuel 19, this is when Michal helps David escape from Saul. Now, David goes out through a window, and Michal puts a teraphim in the bed to give the impression David was there. Now, I know David wasn't a huge guy, but in order to trick someone into thinking that a human body was laying in the bed, I would assume that the teraphim in this case would have been probably at least 5 feet tall. So the teraphim were meant to remain in the home, right? This was a familial thing. It represented power and inheritance, headship. So this begs the question, then why would Rachel steal it? We don't actually get any answer for that in the biblical narrative, but we can speculate. Perhaps she wasn't ready to leave her pagan customs behind and felt that keeping the idol with her would sort of be like a plan B option. Possession of these idols in Nuzi custom, Nuzi, of course, being the ancient Mesopotamian city she was from, represented headship of the family. So whoever had possession of the idol maintained headship over the family. Therefore, the significance of her stealing the teraphim from her father could possibly mean that his headship was no longer sustained. Although this doesn't necessarily mean the headship of the family would be transferred to Rachel, because the teraphim would have to be given, not stolen, technically. The teraphim also acted as a means of receiving an oracle, so it was thought that they would answer questions posed to them. So I can imagine, just with what we've looked at here, that Rachel, she's marrying Jacob, obviously coming into the Israelite culture, but given the landscape she came from, she probably had a tough time putting that away. She was probably looking for some sort of reassurance, I would imagine. So, as we move forward, we need to look at the New Testament perception of this. because it still stands. In the New Testament, we see that idolatry and sexual immorality are continued and seem to go hand in hand. We get these references in Acts 15:20, 1 Corinthians 6:9, 1 Peter 4:3, and Revelation 22:15. Why don't we just pick out one? Let's do Acts 15:20 and we'll have a look at what that says. But should write to them to abstain from the things polluted by idols, and from sexual immorality, and from what has been strangled, and from blood. So we see in the New Testament how this sort of overall lawless living gets lumped in with idolatry here. So this is when we talked about the idolatry existing without the use of physical idols. This is more of what we're talking about here. It seems to correspond to overall lawless living. We see further examples of that in Colossians 3:5 and 1 Peter 4:3, which I think we'll go ahead and take a look at here because it's come up a few times. For the time that is past suffices for doing what the Gentiles want to do, living in sensuality, passions, drunkenness, orgies, drinking parties, and lawless idolatry. Right? So we get a sense now that Paul's expanding the scope here. Like Peter and Paul are expanding the scope here of what idolatry actually is. And it's corresponding to this overall lawless living, this licentiousness, sexual immorality, impurity, lust, evil desires, the works of the flesh all become idolatry. But we have to review Paul's discourse on eating meat sacrificed to idols. And we've done this before on the show. If you listen to my podcast, you've heard this before. But in 1 Corinthians 8, specifically 8:4, Paul tells us that an idol is nothing in this world. Now, oftentimes people stop there, believing that by saying this, Paul is implying the lesser gods do not exist. That's not the case. He's actually making a distinction between God and idol. You just have to keep reading further. Now, the idol is the thing that provides an invitation for very real demonic forces that work to cause spiritual blindness in the hearts and minds of people. So, idolatry is just the tip of what we're getting into. This is what Paul is starting to explain in 1 Corinthians 8. But if we keep reading, and we go to 1 Corinthians 10, verses 19 to 21, we see Paul say, "Do I mean then that food sacrificed to an idol is anything? No, but the sacrifices of pagans are offered to demons, not to God. And I do not want you to be participants with demons. You cannot drink from the cup of the Lord and the cup of demons too. You cannot have a part in both the Lord's table and the table of demons." So, yes, an idol is nothing, as we've seen. Idols can get destroyed and recrafted, it doesn't matter. Many idols can be crafted for a single deity. It doesn't matter. But the gods are real. The territorial guardians, the princes over the principalities are real, and they've been around a lot longer than people. So we need to leave that alone. This is what Paul is telling us. Quite often, I think especially in the new age world, folks can get this sense of pride and cleverness, as though they understand how to deal with the forces of darkness or how to deal with the spiritual world. But the fact is we don't. They have been around since the beginning. We have not. They have seen the course of humanity. They have witnessed it. They have big ideas far beyond what we can imagine. So we don't mess with them. And that's what Paul's saying. We don't acknowledge them. We know that they exist, but we do not communicate with them. We do not reach out to them. We keep our eyes set on Jesus and Jesus alone. All right, so as we wrap up, we're going to touch on what idolatry is not. And this needs to be covered because in the bowels of the internet, I see a lot of things coming up from content creators now, extrapolating this word idolatry and putting it on anything that a human being likes, anything that you spend your time doing. Now you've made an idol out of it. And that is very ignorant to the original context. So, what idolatry is not is your natural human desires, your gifts, your very individual and unique gifts from God, whether you be a creative person, you like to make music, you like to write, anything, your individual, unique gifts from God, the things you find joy in this world are not idolatry. Now, are there things in this world that we can have an idolatrous attitude towards? Of course, we can be obsessed with certain things to the point where we as believers are no longer acknowledging our gift, are no longer acknowledging what we are meant to do to walk in the spirit. Yes, things can get out of hand. You know, there are addictions, there's many things in this world that can become this way, but you need to make that distinction and you need to understand the proper context for what idolatry is. You know, and I have to speak to this because in our own ignorance, we as moderns have just attempted to extrapolate not only this, but so many things from the Hebrew Bible, these specified commands, and then we tailor them to our own narrative. Now, and as I mentioned, I've seen countless Christian based influencers encouraging their listeners to stop going to the gym, stop working out so much, stop watching whatever TV show you enjoy, whatever hobbies you enjoy, because these things take away from your time with God, which is an absolutely ridiculous statement because if you are a believer, you are indwelled by the Holy Spirit, which means that your God, the Most High, is with you all the time. So for me personally, I don't feel the need to back myself into a corner in my house and carve out time because he's always there. I worship him no matter what I'm engaged in through my sufferings and through my best days. So we cannot treat Yahweh like an idol. We do not pick him up and put him down. We don't put him in a corner. He's with us always. Yes, we take time out of our day to hopefully read our scriptures, to spend some time in prayer, but it doesn't end there because he's always with us. All right, guys. Okay, thanks for sticking with me on this long-winded, almost a half-hour session. I really hope you enjoyed it. Coming up, I think maybe we'll talk about Adam's dominion, talk about us being regents on the earth, get into some Eden stuff. There's so many things to pick apart. All right, guys. Don't forget to check out the podcast, which comes out every Saturday morning. This week's podcast is going to be on idolatry too, and we're really going to get into the weeds with it even more than we did in this lesson. Don't forget to like, subscribe, leave a comment if you will, and I will see you on the next one. Bye, guys.